Chapter 4. World Schematism. Quote, all-embracing being is one. In its self-sufficiency, it has nothing alongside it or over it. To associate a second being with it would be to make it something that it is not, namely a part or constituent of a more comprehensive whole. Due to the fact that we extend our unified thought like a framework, nothing that should be comprised in this thought unity can retain a duality within itself. Nor again can anything escape this thought unity. The essence of all thought consists in bringing together the elements of consciousness into a unity. It is the point of unity of the synthesis where the indivisible idea of the world came into being and the universe, as the name itself implies, is apprehended as something in which everything is tied into unity. Unquote. Thus far, Hegelian. This is the first application of the mathematical method. Quote, every question is to be decided axiomatically in accordance with simple basic forms, as if we were dealing with the simple principles of mathematics. Unquote. All-embracing being is one. If tautology, the simple repetition in the predicate of what is already expressed in the subject. If that makes an axiom, then we have here one of the purest water. Hegelian tells us in the subject that being embraces everything, and in the predicate, he intrepidly declares that in that case there is nothing outside it. What colossal, quote, system-creating thought! This is indeed system-creating. Within the space of the next 6 lines, Hegelian has transformed the oneness of being, by means of our unified thought, into its unit. As the essence of all thought consists in bringing things together into a unity, so being, as soon as it is conceived as unified, and the idea of the world as indivisible. And because conceived, being the idea of the world, is unified, therefore real being, the real world, is also an indivisible unity. And with that, quote, there's no longer any room for things beyond, once the mind has learned to conceive being in its homogeneous universality, unquote. That is a campaign which puts Austerlitz and Jena, Königgrätz and Sedan completely in the shade. In a few sentences, hardly a page after we have mobilized the first axiom, we've already done away with, cast overboard, destroyed everything beyond the world, God and the heavenly hosts, heaven, hell, and purgatory, along with the immortality of the soul. How do we get from the oneness of being to its unity? By the very fact of conceiving it. Insofar as we spread our unified thought around being like a frame, its oneness becomes a unity in thought, a thought unity, for the essence of all thought consists in bringing together the elements of consciousness into a unity. This last statement is simply untrue. In the first place, thought consists just as much in the taking apart of objects of consciousness into their elements, as in the putting together of related elements into a unity. Without analysis, no synthesis. Secondly, without making blunders, thought can bring together into a unity only those elements of consciousness in which, or in whose real prototypes, this unity already existed before. If I include a shoe brush in the unity mammals, this does not help it to get mammary glands. The unity of being, or rather, the question whether its conception as a unity is justified, is therefore precisely what has to be proved. And when Hegelian assures us that he conceives being as a unity, and not as twofold, he tells us nothing more than his own unauthoritative opinion. If we try to state his process of thought in unalloyed form, we get the following. I begin with being. I therefore think what being is. The thought of being is a unified thought. But thinking and being must be in agreement. They are in conformity with each other. They coincide. Therefore, being is a unity also in reality. Therefore, there cannot be anything, quote, beyond. If Hegelian had spoken without disguise in this way, instead of treating us to the above oracular passages, his ideology would have been clearly visible. To attempt to prove the reality of any product of thought by the identity of thinking and being was indeed one of the most absurd, delirious fantasies of a Hegel. Even if his whole method of proof had been correct, Hegelian still would not have won an inch of ground from the spiritualists. The latter would reply briefly, to us, too, the universe is simple. The division into this world and the world beyond exists only for our specifically earthly, original sin standpoint. In and for itself, that is, in God, all being is a unity. And they would accompany Herr Duhring to his other beloved celestial bodies, and show him one or several on which there had been no original sin, where therefore no opposition exists between this world and the beyond, and where the unity of the universe is a dogma of faith. The most comical part of the business is that Herr Duhring, in order to prove the non-existence of God from the idea of being, uses the ontological proof for the existence of God. This runs, when we think of God, we conceive him as the sum total of all perfections, but the sum total of all perfections includes above all existence, since a non-existent being is necessarily imperfect. We must therefore include existence among the perfections of God, hence God must exist. Herr Duhring reasons in exactly the same way. When we think of being, we conceive it as one idea. Whatever is comprised in one idea is a unity. Being would not correspond to the idea of being if it were not a unity. Consequently, it must be a unity. Consequently, there is no God, and so on. When we speak of being, and purely of being, unity can only consist in that all the objects to which we are referring are, that is, they exist. They are comprised in the unity of this being, and in no other unity. And the general dictum that they all are not only cannot give them any additional qualities, either common or not, but provisionally excludes all such qualities from consideration. For as soon as we depart even a millimeter from the simple basic fact that being is common to all these things, the differences between these things begin to emerge, and whether these differences consist in the circumstance that some are white and others black, that some are animate and others inanimate, that some may be of this world and others of the world beyond, cannot be decided by us from the fact that mere existence is in equal manner ascribed to them all. The unity of this world does not consist in its being, although its being is a precondition of its unity, as it must certainly first be before it can be one. Being, indeed, is always an open question beyond the point where our sphere of observation ends. The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved not by a few juggled phrases, but by a long and wearisome development of philosophy and natural science. To return to the text, the being which Herr Duhring is telling us about is, quote, not that pure, self-equal being which lacks all special determinants, and in fact represents only the counterpart of the idea of nothing or the absence of idea, unquote. But we shall very soon see that Herr Duhring's universe really starts with a being which lacks all inner differentiation, all motion and change, and is therefore in fact only a counterpart of the idea of nothing, and therefore really nothing. Only out of this being nothing develops the present, differentiated, changing state of the universe, which represents a development, a becoming, and it is only after we have grasped this that we are able, even within this perpetual change, to, quote, maintain the conception of universal being in a self-equal state, unquote. We have now, therefore, the idea of being on a higher plane, where it includes within itself both inertness and change, being and becoming. Having reached this point, we find that, quote, genus and species, or the general and the particular, are the simplest means of differentiation, without which the constitution of things cannot be understood, unquote. But these are means of differentiation of qualities, and after these have been dealt with, we proceed, quote, in opposition to genus stands the concept of magnitude, as of a homogeneity in which no further differences of species exist, unquote. And so from quality we pass to quantity, and this is always, quote, measurable. Let us now compare this, quote, sharp division of the general effect schemata, and its, quote, really critical standpoint, with the crudities, wild ravings, and delirious fantasies of a Hegel. We find that Hegel's logic starts from being, as with Herr Duhring. That being turns out to be nothing, just as with Herr Duhring. That from this being nothing, there is a transition to becoming, the result of which is determinate being, Dasein, i.e. a higher, fuller form of being, Sein, just the same as with Herr Duhring. Determinate being leads on to quality, and quality on to quantity, just the same as with Herr Duhring. And so that no essential feature may be missing, Herr Duhring tells us on another occasion, quote, from the realm of non-sensation, a transition is made to that of sensation, in spite of all quantitative gradations, only through a qualitative leap, of which we can say that it is infinitely different from the mere gradation of one and the same property." Unquote. This is precisely the Hegelian nodal dyne of measure relations, in which, at certain definite nodal points, the purely quantitative increase or decrease gives rise to a qualitative leap. For example, in the case of heated or cooled water, where boiling point and freezing point are the nodes at which, under normal pressure, the leap to a new state of aggregation takes place, and where consequently quantity is transformed into quality. Our investigation has likewise tried to reach down to the roots, and it finds the roots of the deep-rooted basic schemata of Herr Dühring to be the, quote, delirious fantasies of a Hegel, the categories of Hegelian logic, Part 1, the doctrine of being, in strictly old Hegelian, quote, succession, and with hardly any attempt to cloak the plagiarism. And not content with pilfering from his worst slandered predecessor, the latter's whole scheme of being, Herr Dühring, after himself giving the above-quoted example of the leap-like change from quantity into quality, says of Marx, without the slightest perturbation, quote, how ridiculous, for example, is the reference, made by Marx, to the Hegelian confused, hazy notion that quantity is transformed into quality, unquote. Confused, hazy notion. Who has been transformed here? And who is ridiculous here, Herr Dühring? All these pretty little things are therefore not only not, quote, axiomatically decided, as prescribed, but are merely imported from outside, that is to say, from Hegel's logic, and in fact in such a form that in the whole chapter there is not even the semblance of any internal coherence unless borrowed from Hegel, and the whole question finally trickles out in a meaningless subtilizing about space and time, inertness and change. From being, Hegel passes to essence, to dialectics. Here he deals with the determinations of reflection, their internal antagonisms and contradictions, as, for example, positive and negative. He then comes to causality, or the relation of cause and effect, and ends with necessity. Not otherwise, Herr Dühring. What Hegel calls the doctrine of essence, Herr Dühring translates into, quote, logical properties of being. These, however, consist above all in the, quote, antagonism of forces, in opposites. Contradiction, however, Herr Dühring absolutely denies. We will return to this point later. He then passes over to causality, and from this to necessity. So that when Herr Dühring says of himself, quote, we, who do not philosophize out of a cage, unquote, he apparently means that he philosophizes in a cage, namely, the cage of the Hegelian schematism of categories.